Hey guys, Mr. Simpson back here, and we are talking about the New England colonies. So specifically, what we're talking about is the Plymouth colony and the Massachusetts Bay colony, which eventually will become one, and will just be called Massachusetts. Then we also have Connecticut, and then Rhode Island coming a little bit later. So Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, Connecticut, they kind of come around the same time. Rhode Island comes a little bit later, and we'll explain why that happens a little bit. Let you know it's some controversy because history is not a history without some controversy. All right, let's move right along. So let's talk about the environment, the economy, and the society of New England, just kind of as a whole. There are some variations, but let's just talk about it just in general terms. So first, the environment is very cold, it's rocky, but it's much healthier than the Chesapeake. But it's really not good for plantations, so there's not going to be a lot of large-scale farming like we see in the Chesapeake and eventually in the southern colonies. The economy is mostly based on family farming, fishing, trade, and shipping. So we're going to see some timber, some lumber industry for making ships. The society is what we call egalitarian, this word right here, egalitarian. All that really means is that things are balanced, fairly equal, but not, fair, just balanced, okay? There's not too many poor, there's not too many wealthy people, it's kind of an even mix. There is a high amount of literacy because there's a lot of educated people, which is what leads us to the discussion of religion. And it's very, very strict in terms of religion, with a few exceptions, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. And there's this thing called Puritan work ethic, where all members of the family are expected to work to run the family business, the farm, and the home. So there's not going to be very, very much slavery in the New England colonies. All right, so let's talk about Puritans. Okay, so this is our real discussion about religion. These Puritans are seeking to reform or purify the Church of England, which I will refer to as this COE later on. So they're trying to purify the church from these elements of Catholicism, and I'll show you one of them in a moment. They're mostly wealthy Englishmen, these gentry class people, again, that we talked about in the Chesapeake. And these Puritans divided the English colony. And some of the ways they divided is that they called for an end to Christmas here when they come into North America. But they railed against things like the theater and plays and something called bear baiting, which is pretty much animal abuse, where chained up bears would have to fight off free dogs, which is terrible and horrible, and they should call against that. But English society was like, why are you taking away our stuff? And the real reason was because it happened on Sundays, and they thought that Sunday should be a day that you leave to the Lord. And so they even questioned the King James version of the Bible. Quick note about British history: King James made his own version of the Bible in 1611, which we still use today. And the Puritans mostly followed what's called the Geneva Bible, which was translated in Geneva, Switzerland. They felt it was more of a true translation of the Bible. The Church of England also prohibited Puritans from ministering, and so that's one of the reasons why they leave, because they're considered a security threat to England. And some Puritans wanted to separate completely from the Church of England. So let's just be clear. Many Puritans just wanted to reform the Church of England, but there was a group that were like, no, we need to separate completely, form our own church, and those people would do that, as we will see. But that's just kind of the variations of Puritans. So here's one of the ways that Puritans were different. So if we look here on this side, we see this picture of this 17th century. So this church was built around the 1600s, Catholic church. This is in Italy. And here we see a church built around the same time. This is an Anglican church, also known as the Church of England. And so notice the similarities between the two. And then here's a Puritan church, or a Congregationalist church, built around the same time. Notice the shift from the left in the middle to the far right. Okay, so they're wanting to wipe out elements of Catholicism because they saw Catholicism as heretical, this belief that only a priest should read. They believe that everyone, mostly men, should have only men really, should have the right to preach and read the Bible and know for themselves. But I digress. So the Plymouth colony is established in 1620. It is the first Puritan colony to be established. So these first Puritans that come are called Pilgrims. They are separatists, and they seek religious freedom entirely. And they sail on board the Mayflower, as we know the story goes. They found it on Plymouth Rock. No, they don't land on a rock. They just, in 17 something, they picked up a rock and said, this is where they landed. Um, but on board the Mayflower, they signed something called the Mayflower Compact. And so this is a rationale for colonization. And in this Mayflower Compact is this sort of like agreement to work together, this sort of like democratic government that would be established and would really pave the way for the type of government that the United States would have once it got its freedom from England. William Bradford is one of the main ones who signs it, and he's kind of the person who's kind of spearheading this thing. And it expresses these ideals of working together, but mostly this democratic idea of government where each one does their part to work together to make sure the colony survives, which is really democracy at its core. This is a image of a transcript of the compact that William Bradford and 40 others signed. So the Massachusetts Bay Colony is part of the second wave of Puritans that come. So we have the initial group around the 1620, and so then some years later, another group of Puritans come and they arrive in America and they establish what's called the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So just a little bit northwest of Plymouth, but still in kind of the same area. And John Winthrop is the first governor, and he's a minister who gives this message called a model of Christian charity. And he presents the ideals of what the Massachusetts Bay Colony should be like: community and unity and exceptionalism. And so this is where we get this idea of American exceptionalism, that God has somehow ordained us, or rather at the time them, to do the work of the Lord. And of course, historians would jump on that and say that, hey, well, America is this destined country for greatness. And we'll talk more about that later. And so he says that the Massachusetts Bay Colony is supposed to be this city on a hill, and Boston would wind up being that city that he's talking about, but this sort of like beacon of true Puritanism for the entire world to see. And so by that, he hoped to win Native Americans. And he does. There are some Native American converts who go on to be ministers in Puritanism. And so this is John Winthrop there that you can see. So here's how religion and culture play in New England. We have these things called praying towns, where this guy named John Eliot wants to establish these towns for Native American converts to learn more about Puritan ideals. So religion plays this really strong role in New England. They believe in predestination and the supernatural, and they believe that every event was a sign of either God's mercy or God's judgment. And they believed in witchcraft, and you know where I'm going with this, the Salem witch trials. Okay, so this is where basically hundreds of people were accused of witchcraft, mostly women, and the result is 19 people were executed. Have no fear, we will talk about this later this week. Okay, just to give you an idea of Puritanism, this is the inside of the old Ship Church in Massachusetts, and just notice how the congregation is separated. And just to give you a hint and a window, if you were super wealthy, you got to sit up here, right by the priest. And the less money you had and the less status you had, the further back you would sit. If you had very little status, you got to sit up here. But if you were super wealthy, you got to be right next to Jesus and the minister. So, pays to be rich. So religious intolerance. This guy named Roger Williams, he leaves the Massachusetts Bay Colony and goes and founds his own colony called Rhode Island in 1636. And he's arguing for this full separation from the Church of England. And his argument is that the state can't punish you based on the ideas that you have. Well, he was wrong. And so they found him guilty of heresy, and he eventually is given the opportunity to leave, and he leaves and forms this Rhode Island colony, which is a haven for those who are dissenting from Puritanism and want to, it kind of becomes sort of like a religious freedom place where people of all faiths can kind of go. And so here we also have Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson is kind of a tragic story. She criticized Puritan practices, and she believed that women could hear from God and preach as well. And she did preach. But unfortunately, she was convicted and excommunicated, which means she was removed completely from the faith. So notice the difference. If you're a man, you're allowed to move on. But if you're a woman, Jesus has no place for you. Don't even try to preach. So we see this sort of intolerance rise up. Unfortunately, Anne Hutchinson would eventually be killed by Native Americans. And John Winthrop, our friend from the beginning, would say that it was God's judgment, thus solidifying this idea that if something good happens, it's God's mercy, but if something bad, it's God's judgment. right? So how dare she try to preach? God hated that apparently, and John Winthrop was fine. So interactions with Native Americans, we've got two big wars. One is called the Pequot War, which takes place over a course of 11 months, spanning from 1636 to 1637. And really, it's just the Pequot people versus a coalition of English and Native Americans in the Massachusetts area. And the purpose is just to eliminate the Pequot altogether and control the fur trade so that England could, guess what? All right. And it's the first sustained conflict, and it is extremely brutal. And so here's of course, an English depiction of it, and you can see the Native Americans are surrounding the Port English here as they're just trying to protect, again, solidifying that idea that the wars would cause the English to present the Native Americans as these bloodthirsty people. And the Pequot were really just trying to protect their investments and protect their trade. Another one is this thing called King Philip's War. This has a very tragic end. It's a war with the Wampanoag people in the Massachusetts area. And I'm going to show you a picture in a moment of it, where this leader named Metacom, which is just an awesome name for a person, but he's called King Philip by the English, and it's kind of a demeaning term. He's trying to prevent the English from moving further west into their territories. And so the English, aided by the Mohegans, who were a rival of the Wampanoag, and Christian Native Americans, they kind of come into agreement together, and they defeat Metacom and his people, and they sell the captives into slavery to the West Indies, which we'll talk about later next week. But they also decapitate Metacom, and they put his head on a post in Plymouth to warn other Native Americans and to let them know that the British were in charge of this area. But the impact of this and all the other wars, but mainly this war, is it completely changes the perception of Native Americans in the minds of the English. And it causes the writers and artists to depict Native Americans as these bloodthirsty savages who are surrounding and trying to take over the English land, and the British are just doing what they're supposed to do. They're doing God's duty, as Winthrop would say. But it also begins this racial hatred of Native Americans, which becomes this sort of defining feature of New England, this sort of Puritan stronghold where God's peace is supposed to reside, yet they have this profound hatred for Native Americans. Here's a kind of a picture of the tribes who were in this area during King Philip's War. And you see a lot of different in the red. These are all the Native American groups. And so as the Native Americans are in these areas previously, these British are encroaching upon their lands. And so these wars are taking place because of this. And here's just kind of a snapshot of just some British depictions of King Philip's War. We have one here of King Philip, or Metacom, how he looks. He's kind of dressed sort of like a European kind of figure. But here we have the British coming in, and they're trying to attack the fort that the Native Americans have, again, showing the Native Americans as a much stronger force than the British. Down here we have the Native Americans are moving in to attack a British garrison with a flaming thing of hay on a wheelbarrow. And here also we have a depiction of Native Americans coming to attack a British in retaliation. So again, these wars caused the British to really kind of shift their focus and depict Native Americans as these savages who are bloodthirsty, just coming after them, and they have to do their duty to protect. And so in the next video, we'll share briefly about the Middle Colonies, and that'll be kind of the end of our notes for this week.